She hired him to clean toilets. She didn't know he was about to save her billion-dollar company with a piece of chalk. Before you find out how a janitor humiliated an entire boardroom of executives, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, and stick around. Because what happens next will make you furious, and then it will make you cry. This is the story of the genius nobody wanted to remember. The rain hadn't stopped since 6 in the morning, and Vivian Sterling hated rain like this. The kind that didn't fall so much as sit on the city, gray and patient, like it had nowhere else to be. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her office on the 41st floor of Sterling Dynamics, watching the cars crawl along the avenue below, and she thought, not for the first time that week, that running a company this size had stopped feeling like an accomplishment and started feeling like a leash. "Ms. Sterling?" She turned. Her assistant Priya stood in the doorway with a tablet pressed against her chest like a shield. "The HR director wants your sign-off on the janitorial hires," Priya said. 3 positions. She says it's routine, but she needs your signature because of the building-wide security clearance update. Vivian almost waved her off. In a company of 4,000 employees, she didn't sign off on mop and bucket positions. That wasn't how Sterling Dynamics worked, and it wasn't how she worked. She had 212 direct reports across 9 divisions, a board breathing down her neck about Q3 margins, and a system migration in 14 days that her CTO swore would either make the company or break it. She did not have time for janitors. "Just send it to my desk," she said. "I'll glance at it before end of day." Priya nodded and left, and Vivian went back to the window, back to the rain, back to the slow gray crawl of traffic that made her feel, for just a second, like the whole city was as tired as she was. It was nearly 7 that evening, long after most of the 41st floor had emptied out, long after Priya had gone home, long after the cleaning crews had already started their rounds 2 floors below, that Vivian finally pulled the tablet toward her and opened the file. She was tired. She wanted to sign it and go home and pour a glass of wine and not think about spreadsheets for 12 hours. She scrolled through the 3 names without really reading them: Maria Delgado, Henry Okafor, and... She stopped. She read the name again. Nathan Brooks. It wasn't an uncommon name. There were probably 100 Nathan Brookses in this city alone. She told herself that even as her thumb hovered over the screen, even as something cold and electric moved up the back of her neck. She tapped the file open. There was a photo, a small, low-resolution headshot, the kind they take for ID badges, not for memories. And a man stared back at her with tired eyes, and a face that had aged more than 10 years should have aged a person. But it was him. She would have known that face anywhere. She'd spent 4 years memorizing it across lecture halls and library tables, watching it bent over equations that made grown professors go quiet with respect. Nathan Brooks, the boy who solved Professor Whitfield's impossible topology proof in 11 minutes during finals week, while the rest of them were still copying down the question. The boy who got a standing ovation, an actual standing ovation, in a math department, which simply did not happen, after his senior thesis defense. The boy everyone said would end up at MIT or Princeton or some research lab nobody else was smart enough to get hired at. The boy she had once, quietly, in the embarrassing way you don't admit to anyone, been a little in love with. Vivian sat back in her chair. Her heart was doing something strange and uneven in her chest, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum like that would calm it down. Janitorial position, night shift. Sterling Tower, floors 30 through 45. "What happened to you?" she whispered to the screen, to the photograph. To 12 years of silence, she suddenly realized she'd never properly closed. She told herself she wasn't going to do anything strange. She told herself, walking down to the 38th floor the next morning with a coffee she didn't even want, that this was simply due diligence, that any responsible CEO would want to personally welcome new staff, that this had nothing to do with the fact that she'd barely slept, replaying old memories of a boy with chalk dust on his sleeves who used to argue with her about prime number distributions like it was the most romantic thing in the world. She told herself a lot of things. The break room on 38 smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. 3 new hires sat around a folding table while an HR coordinator named Doug ran through onboarding paperwork in the flat, bored voice of a man who had given this exact speech 400 times. Vivian stood in the doorway, unseen, and let her eyes move across the room until they landed on him. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not in height. He was still tall, still broad through the shoulders, in a way that used to make her feel safe standing next to him in crowded lecture halls, but smaller in presence. He sat with his shoulders curved slightly inward, his hands folded on the table, his work boots, old, the leather cracked at the toe, planted flat on the floor like a man bracing for something. He wore a gray uniform shirt one size too big for him, the Sterling Dynamics logo stitched crooked over the breast pocket, and he was listening to Doug with the careful, patient attention of someone who had learned somewhere along the way not to ask questions even when he had them. "Nathan Brooks," Doug said, checking his clipboard. "That's me," Nathan said. His voice hadn't changed. That was the strangest part. 12 years, and his voice was exactly the same, low, a little rough at the edges, with that particular calm in it that used to make professors stop mid-sentence just to see what he'd say next. Vivian's coffee cup trembled slightly in her hand. She didn't go in. Not that day. She told herself she needed time to think, to figure out what she wanted to say, how she wanted to approach this without looking like exactly what she was, a woman who'd stumbled across a ghost from her own past and didn't know what to do with him. So she watched from the doorway for 3 more minutes, watched him nod along to safety procedures and badge protocols, watched him accept a mop and a cart and a laminated map of the building like it was the most ordinary transaction in the world, and then she turned and walked back to the elevator before he could see her. It took her 4 days to work up the nerve, 4 days of pulling his personnel file at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. 4 days of staring at a resume that made her chest ache. A bachelor's degree in applied mathematics, summa cum laude, from a university that had once tried to recruit him into a doctoral program before he vanished off every academic radar that existed. After that, nothing. A 10-year gap with no employment history that HR could find, and then, 3 years ago, a string of jobs. Warehouse stalker, delivery driver, overnight security, each one shorter than the last, like a man circling something he couldn't quite land on. 4 days of asking herself why a man who once made calculus professors look slow was now pushing a cleaning cart through her building at 11 o'clock at night. On the 5th night, she found him on the 31st floor, alone, wiping down the glass partition outside the East Conference Room. The overhead lights were dimmed to the after-hours setting, casting everything in a soft amber glow, and he worked with a kind of quiet efficiency that made it clear he wasn't performing for anyone. This was simply how he did things, methodical and unhurried, even when no one was watching. "Nathan." He turned. For a moment there was nothing in his face, just the polite, neutral expression of an employee addressed by a stranger. Then something shifted. His eyes moved over her face, and she watched recognition land on him slowly, like a stone dropping through deep water. "Vivian?" His voice cracked slightly on her name. He set the cloth down on the cart, almost automatically, like his hands needed something to do that wasn't holding still. "Vivian Sterling, God, I didn't realize this was your company." "Sterling Dynamics," she said. "I started it about 6 years ago. You didn't know?" "I don't really follow business news," he said, and there was something almost embarrassed in the way he said it, like he was apologizing for not having kept up with a version of the world he no longer felt he belonged to. "I saw the building. I saw the job posting. I didn't put it together that—" He stopped himself, shook his head slightly. "I'm sorry. I should be working." He reached for the cloth again, and something about the speed of it, the way he was already trying to retreat back into the role of an invisible employee, made something twist hard in Vivian's chest. "Nathan, wait!" He stopped. "Can we talk?" she said. "Not as your boss, just as 2 people who used to know each other." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing something, deciding something, the same way he used to weigh a difficult proof before committing chalk to board. Finally, he nodded toward a small seating area near the elevator bank, 2 chairs and a low table, the kind of space designed for nobody in particular to linger. They sat. He kept his hands folded in his lap, the posture of a man who'd learned to make himself smaller in rooms that weren't built for him. "How long has it been?" she asked, even though she knew exactly how long it had been. 12 years, 4 months since graduation day, since she'd watched him walk across that stage to thunderous applause and then disappear from every group chat, every alumni email, every life she'd half expected to keep brushing up against hers. 12 years, he said, give or take. You vanished, she said. It came out more honest than she meant it to. Everyone thought you'd end up published, tenured, running some lab somewhere. Professor Whitfield used to mention your name like it was a benchmark. Brooks would have solved this in half the time. I used to hate hearing it, honestly, because it meant I was always being measured against a ghost. Something flickered across his face. Not pride, not even nostalgia, but something closer to pain quickly suppressed. Things didn't go the way anyone expected, mine included. What happened? He was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands. They were rough now, she noticed. Calloused in places that hadn't been calloused 12 years ago, when those same hands had held nothing heavier than chalk and a mechanical pencil. Life happened, he said finally, and the way he said it closed the subject as firmly as a door. I have a daughter now, 8 years old. Her name's Emma. She's the smartest, most stubborn kid you'll ever meet, and she needs me a lot more than some research lab ever did. Vivian felt something soften and ache simultaneously. You're a father. Single father, he said, and there was no self-pity in it, just plain fact, the way he used to state theorems. Have been for a while now. And the cleaning job pays the bills, comes with decent hours, lets me be home before Emma's bedtime most nights. He met her eyes then, steady, almost daring her to feel sorry for him. It's honest work, Vivian. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not suggesting you should be. She leaned forward slightly. But I have an analyst position open. Data modeling, systems architecture, work that would actually use what you're capable of. Better pay. Benefits. A path forward instead of a dead end. She watched him consider it, actually consider it, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking briefly toward the window like he was doing some private calculation she wasn't privy to. And for a second she thought she'd won, thought she'd get to watch him step back into the life that had always seemed built for him. Then he shook his head. No, he said. Thank you, but no. Nathan, I appreciate it. I do. He stood, and the conversation, she understood, was over whether she liked it or not. But I've had enough of chasing things that look impressive on paper. I want something simple, something I can control. I clean, I go home, I see my daughter. I don't have a board of directors deciding whether I keep my job based on a quarterly number I had nothing to do with. He picked the cleaning cloth back up, turned it over in his hands once like he was grounding himself. I'm not running from anything. I just want a quiet life. Can you understand that? She didn't, not really. Not the version of him she remembered, the boy who used to talk about proving the Riemann hypothesis like other boys talked about winning championships. But she nodded anyway, because pushing harder felt like it would break something fragile that she didn't fully understand yet. Okay, she said softly. Okay, Nathan. He gave her a small, tired smile, the first genuine one she'd seen from him since she'd walked up, and it carved 12 years of distance into something almost bearable. It's good to see you, Vivian. Really, I mean that. It's good to see you too, she said, and meant it more than she expected to. He nodded once, picked up his cart, and walked back down the hallway, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished floor until the sound faded around the corner. Vivian sat alone in the dim amber light for a long time after he'd gone, staring at nothing, turning his words over and over. I just want a quiet life. It sounded reasonable. It sounded, on its surface, like the kind of thing any tired, overworked person might say. But she'd known him once, really known him, in the specific way you know someone when you're 20 and certain the whole world is opening up in front of you. And she knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that what he'd just told her wasn't the whole truth. Men like Nathan Brooks didn't walk away from brilliance because they got tired of chasing it. Something had broken him along the way. Broken him hard enough that pushing a mop felt safer than touching a calculator again. And she intended to find out what. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in her apartment, 30 floors above a city that never fully went quiet, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the boy in her memory with the man she'd just spoken to. In her memory, Nathan Brooks had been loud in his own quiet way. Not loud in volume, never that, but loud in conviction. He used to corner her in the library at 2 in the morning, eyes bright with some idea he couldn't keep to himself, sketching proofs on napkins because he didn't want to lose the thought before reaching his notebook. He'd been arrogant sometimes, in the particular way smart 20-year-olds are arrogant, but it had never felt cruel. It had felt like watching someone burn so bright you wanted to stand closer to the heat. The man tonight had no heat left in him. Or, she corrected herself, turning onto her side, staring at the gray rectangle of her window. No, that wasn't quite right either. The heat was still there. She'd seen it flicker once, just once, when he talked about his daughter. It was banked now, buried under something. Protected, maybe. The way you protect an ember you're afraid will go out if you let too much air touch it. She got up at 5, made coffee she didn't drink, and opened her laptop. She started where anyone would start, searching his name, scrolling through what little the internet still remembered of Nathan Brooks. There were old university press releases about his thesis defense, an archived photo from an academic conference where he'd presented research as an undergraduate, standing next to professors twice his age who all looked faintly intimidated. A short blurb from a regional newspaper, 11 years old now, announcing that he'd been accepted into a prestigious doctoral fellowship. Full funding, a name on it that made other mathematicians go quiet with envy. And then nothing. The trail simply stopped. No dissertation, no published papers, no faculty listing anywhere. It was as if Nathan Brooks had taken one step toward the life everyone expected of him, and then dissolved. She thought about calling Professor Whitfield. He was retired now, she knew, but she still had his number from a fundraising gala 2 years back where he'd shaken her hand and told her, with obvious pride, that he'd taught her once. She almost did it. Her thumb hovered over the call button at 6 in the morning, and then she set the phone down, because some instinct told her this wasn't a story that belonged to an old professor's gossip. This was Nathan's story, and if she wanted the truth, she needed to be careful about how she went digging for it. She went into the office 2 hours later than usual, and the first thing she did before checking her calendar or her inbox was pull up the building's HR system and quietly flag Nathan's employee file for follow-up review. Nothing invasive, she told herself, just enough to keep an eye on how he was doing, to make sure whatever had broken him wasn't still actively breaking him somewhere on her watch. Over the following 2 weeks, Vivian found herself doing something she would never have admitted to anyone. She started timing her late nights around his shift. It wasn't stalking, she told herself. It was simply that she worked late often enough, and the building was quiet enough after 8, that running into him doing his rounds on the upper floors felt natural rather than engineered. Most nights, they only exchanged a few words. A nod in the hallway, a brief comment about the weather or the new security badges, or some minor building issue he'd flagged for facilities. He was unfailingly polite, unfailingly careful. He never overstepped, never lingered too long, never said anything that wasn't strictly necessary. And Vivian found herself, against every instinct of professional discretion she possessed, wanting more from those conversations than he was willing to give. One night, nearly 3 weeks after she'd first found his file, she caught him sitting alone in the break room on the 35th floor during what should have been his rounds, a small spiral notebook open in front of him, pencil moving fast and sure across the page. She stopped in the doorway, watching without meaning to. He wasn't writing words. He was writing numbers. Dense columns of figures, equations stacked on top of each other, the kind of notation that meant absolutely nothing to her and clearly everything to him. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his lips moving slightly like he was talking himself through the logic, and for just a moment, just one unguarded moment before he noticed her, she saw the boy from the lecture hall again. Fully, completely, alive in a way she hadn't seen since she'd found him. Then he looked up and the notebook snapped shut so fast it nearly slid off the table. "Ms. Sterling," he said, suddenly formal in a way that stung more than it should have. "Sorry, I was just taking my break a little early. I'll get back to my floor." "Nathan, it's fine. You don't have to—" "It's fine," he said again, already standing, already tucking the notebook into the inner pocket of his work jacket like it was something he needed to hide. "I should keep moving. Falling behind makes the next shift's job harder." She watched him go, watched the careful, deliberate way he avoided her eyes on the way out, and she understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that he hadn't been hiding the notebook from his boss. He'd been hiding it from her specifically, from the part of his past she represented, from the version of himself that notebook proved he hadn't fully let go of, no matter how many times he insisted he wanted a simple, quiet life. She brought it up with Priya the next morning, carefully, framing it as idle curiosity rather than the consuming question it had actually become. "Do we have a wellness program?" Vivian asked, scrolling through her inbox without really seeing it. "For staff, not just executives. Something for the cleaning crews too?" Priya glanced up from her own laptop, faintly surprised. "We have the standard EAP, mental health line, that sort of thing. Why, is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. I just want to make sure we're actually taking care of everyone here, not just the people on this floor." It wasn't a lie, exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth either. Priya studied her for a second too long. "This is about the new janitor, isn't it? The one you flagged for follow-up review." Vivian's head stilled on the keyboard. "It's not what you think." "I didn't say anything," Priya said, holding up both hands, though there was the faintest knowing curve at the corner of her mouth. "I'm just saying, you've never personally flagged a janitorial hire for follow-up in the 6 years I've worked for you. I'm not judging, I'm just observing." "We went to college together," Vivian admitted finally, because there was no point pretending otherwise, not with Priya, who had been with her since the very first year of Sterling Dynamics, and had earned the right to a little honesty. He was the most brilliant person I'd ever met, top of every class, headed for a career that should have made his name mean something in academic circles for the next 50 years. And now he's pushing a mop cart through my building at 11 at night, and he won't tell me why, and I can't stop thinking about it. Priya was quiet for a moment, considering. "Maybe it's not your business to know why," she said gently. "People are allowed to change paths, Vivian. Not everyone wants the life that looks impressive from the outside." "I know that," Vivian said. "I do. But I don't think this is him changing paths because he wanted something different. I think something happened to him, something that took the path away, and he's been telling himself ever since that he chose this instead." Priya didn't have an answer for that, and Vivian didn't expect one. She closed her laptop, looked out at the gray morning skyline, and made a decision she would turn over in her mind for days afterward, unsure whether it was compassion or selfishness driving her. She decided she would find out the truth, not to expose him, not to embarrass him, but because some old, stubborn part of her, the part that used to stay up till 3 in the morning arguing with him about prime numbers, the part that had quietly, foolishly loved the brightness of him before either of them knew what to do with it, refused to accept that a mind like his had simply chosen to disappear into obscurity for no reason at all. The opportunity came faster than she expected and not in the way she wanted. It was a Thursday, 11 days after the notebook incident, when Marcus Webb, the operations manager for facilities and maintenance, a man who'd been with the company for 4 years and ran his department like a small, anxious kingdom, called an unscheduled meeting with HR to discuss what he termed a conduct issue with one of the new janitorial hires. Vivian only heard about it because Doug, the HR coordinator, mentioned it in passing during an unrelated budget call, clearly not realizing the name attached to the complaint would mean anything to the CEO of the company. "Brooks," Doug said, flipping through a folder. "Marcus says he's been overstepping his role. Apparently he corrected one of the engineers on something in the elevator last week, some statistic about server load, I don't know the details, and Marcus is worried it sets a bad precedent, staff sticking their noses into things above their pay grade." Something hot and immediate flared in Vivian's chest. "He corrected an engineer about server load." "That's what I'm told." Doug shrugged, oblivious to the way Vivian's jaw had tightened. "Honestly, it sounds like a nothing issue, but Marcus wants it documented. Says it's about maintaining boundaries." "Send me the full complaint," Vivian said, her voice flatter than she intended. "I want to read it myself." Doug blinked, surprised. CEOs did not typically request to review minor facilities complaints, but he nodded and said he'd forward it within the hour. She read it twice that afternoon, and both times it made her angrier than the last. Marcus's complaint was 3 paragraphs of vague, defensive language dressed up as professional concern, but underneath the corporate phrasing, what it actually said was simple. A janitor had made an offhand correction in an elevator, the engineer had quietly verified it was accurate, and Marcus felt threatened enough by that small moment to escalate it into a formal personnel issue. It wasn't really about boundaries. It was about a man in a position of small authority feeling diminished by someone he'd decided, the moment he saw the uniform, didn't deserve to know more than he did. Vivian didn't intervene directly. Not yet. She filed the complaint, made a private note in her own records, and resolved to watch Marcus Webb a great deal more closely going forward. But that evening, walking the 38th floor on her way out, she found herself slowing as she passed the supply closet where Nathan was restocking shelves, and she stopped in the doorway without entirely meaning to. "I heard about the elevator," she said. He didn't look surprised that she knew. He simply kept stacking boxes, his movements unhurried. It was nothing. The numbers on a slide didn't add up. And the guy mentioned it out loud, frustrated, and I said something I shouldn't have. My mistake. It wasn't a mistake to be right. It was a mistake to open my mouth, he said, finally turning to face her, and there was something tired in his eyes that went deeper than a long shift. "Vivian, I've learned the hard way that being right doesn't matter much if it makes people around you feel small. I should have kept quiet and let the engineer figure it out himself." "Or," she said, "the engineer could have thanked you instead of running off to complain to his manager that a janitor embarrassed him." A faint, humorless smile crossed Nathan's face. "That would require a kind of world I haven't lived in for a long time." She wanted to ask him what world he had lived in. What exactly had taught him to shrink himself down this small, to apologize for being correct, to treat his own intelligence like something dangerous he needed to keep contained. But his eyes had already gone careful again, already retreated behind that same polite distance he kept around her, and she understood that pushing tonight would only make him pull further away. "Just be careful," she said instead. "Marcus Webb isn't someone you want as an enemy in this building." "I'm not trying to make enemies," Nathan said quietly. "I never am. People just decide to be threatened by things I can't really help." He went back to stacking boxes, and Vivian stood in the doorway a moment longer before finally turning to leave, her mind churning with a slow building certainty that something in this building, something bigger than an elevator argument about server statistics, was eventually going to force the truth about Nathan Brooks out into the open, whether either of them was ready for it or not. She didn't know yet how right she was. She didn't know that in less than 2 weeks, a catastrophic system failure would rip through Sterling Dynamics' entire infrastructure, that hundreds of millions of dollars would hang in the balance, while her best engineers stood paralyzed in a conference room, and that the man currently restocking paper towels in a supply closet on the 38th floor would be the only person in the entire company capable of stopping it. She only knew, standing there in the dim hallway light, that some quiet, stubborn instinct in her refused to let this man disappear back into anonymity a second time, not without a fight. Marcus Webb had a habit of checking his reflection in the elevator doors before they fully opened, smoothing down his tie, rolling his shoulders back like a man perpetually walking into a meeting that mattered more than it did. He'd worked his way up at Sterling Dynamics over 4 years, through a combination of genuine competence and an instinct for making himself visible at exactly the right moments, and somewhere in that climb he'd developed the conviction that authority was a thing you had to defend constantly, or it would slip out from under you. The complaint about Nathan hadn't really been about an elevator conversation. It had been about the look on the engineer's face when he realized the janitor was right. That flicker of surprise, of recalibration, the kind of look that made Marcus's stomach tighten because he recognized, somewhere underneath his own bluster, that it could just as easily have been pointed at him. He didn't think about it that way, of course. He told himself it was about professionalism, about boundaries, about maintaining the kind of order that kept a building of 4,000 employees from collapsing into chaos. So when he saw Nathan in the stairwell 2 days later, mop bucket parked at the landing, quietly humming something under his breath while he worked, Marcus stopped on the steps above him and let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. "Brooks?" Nathan looked up. "Mr. Webb, I heard you had some thoughts about the analytics presentation last week." "I didn't mean to step out of line," Nathan said evenly. "It wasn't my place." "No," Marcus agreed, descending another step, close enough now that Nathan had to tilt his head slightly to keep eye contact. It wasn't. You're here to keep the floors clean and the trash cans empty. That's it. That's the whole job description. You understand that? I understand. I don't think you do, Marcus said, and there was something almost satisfied creeping into his voice now, the tone of a man who'd found a place to plant his flag. Because if you understood it, you wouldn't have opened your mouth in the first place. People like you, and I mean this as advice, not an insult, people in your position do better when they stay in their lane. Less attention, fewer problems. You've got a kid to support, don't you? Seems like the kind of job you'd want to keep quiet and easy. Nathan's jaw tightened, just barely, the only outward sign that the comment had landed somewhere it shouldn't have. I appreciate the advice, he said, his voice carefully flat. It won't happen again. Marcus nodded, satisfied, and continued down the stairs without another word, leaving Nathan standing alone on the landing with his mop bucket and the particular kind of silence that settles over a person who has just swallowed something bitter for the sake of peace. He didn't tell Vivian about that conversation. He didn't tell anyone. He simply went back to work, finished his rounds, clocked out at 11:40, and drove the 23 minutes home to the small rented house where his daughter Emma was already asleep, curled up under a blanket covered in cartoon planets, the babysitter dozing on the couch with the television still murmuring low in the background. He paid the sitter, locked the door behind her, and stood for a long moment in his daughter's doorway, watching her breathe, before he went to the kitchen table, pulled out his notebook, and did what he did almost every night once the house went quiet. He opened to the next blank page and let his mind go somewhere Marcus Webb could never follow it. 3 weeks passed in something close to a rhythm. Vivian threw herself back into the grinding pace of running a billion-dollar company, board calls, investor updates, the relentless churn of decisions that needed to be made by 5 o'clock, whether or not she had the information to make them well. And she told herself, mostly successfully, that she had to let the question of Nathan Brooks settle for a while. She still flagged his file in her quieter moments. She still found herself glancing toward the maintenance schedule to see what floor he'd be working on a given night. But she stopped pushing. She gave him the space he'd asked for, even though some part of her ached every time she passed him in a hallway and watched him nod politely and keep moving, the same careful distance held between them like a fence neither of them had built, but both of them respected. It was a Tuesday morning, sharp and clear after weeks of rain, when everything fell apart at once. It started small. A flicker in the dashboard that monitored Sterling Dynamics' core processing infrastructure, the system that handled real-time data routing for every client contract the company managed, from logistics firms tracking shipments across 3 continents to financial institutions running automated trading models that depended on millisecond-accurate data feeds. A junior systems engineer named Daniel noticed the flicker at 8:14 in the morning, frowned at it, ran a standard diagnostic, and didn't think much of it when the diagnostic came back clean. By 9:40, the flicker had become a stutter. By 10:15, 3 major client systems had thrown error logs simultaneously, and the stutter had become an outright failure cascading through the network like a crack spreading across ice. By 10:30, every senior engineer in the building had been pulled into the largest conference room on the 39th floor, and Vivian Sterling stood at the head of the table with her arms crossed, watching her chief technology officer, a sharp, usually unflappable woman named Renata Cole, stare at a wall of monitors with an expression Vivian had never seen on her before. Fear. "Talk to me," Vivian said, and her voice came out harder than she meant it to, but the room needed hardness right now, not panic. "What exactly is happening?" "The core routing system is failing," Renata said. "Not one client, all of them. Every contract running through our processing layer is either degraded or completely down. We've got logistics clients who can't track shipments. We've got financial clients whose automated systems just lost their data feed mid-trade. And the backup systems aren't catching the load because," she gestured helplessly at the monitors, "because something in the core architecture itself is broken, and we cannot find where." "How bad?" Vivian said. Renata hesitated, which was answer enough. "Renata, how bad?" "If we don't have this fixed within 6 hours, we start triggering breach of contract clauses with at least 11 major clients. If we're still down by end of day, conservative estimate, we're looking at upward of $300 million in direct losses and penalty payouts. That's before we calculate the damage to the company's reputation, which Renata's voice cracked slightly just once before she pulled it back under control, which could be a great deal worse than the dollar figure. The room went very quiet. Around the table sat 8 of the most credentialed engineers Vivian had ever hired, people with doctorates from institutions that didn't hand them out easily, people who'd built systems for aerospace companies and federal contractors before coming to Sterling Dynamics, and every single one of them looked like they were watching their careers burn down in real time. "What's the actual cause?" Vivian said. "Not symptoms, cause." A man named Felix Argent, the senior architect who'd built much of the original routing system 5 years earlier, rubbed both hands over his face before answering. "We think it's a cascading failure in the load balancing algorithm, something in the mathematical model that calculates traffic distribution across the server nodes has started producing errors under specific high-volume conditions, and once one node fails, it dumps its load onto the others, which then fail too, which dumps more load, and it just..." He made a small explosive gesture with his hands. "Snowballs. Can you fix the algorithm?" "We're trying. We've had 3 teams on it since 9 this morning. The problem is the model is enormously complex. It was built to optimize for about 40 different variables simultaneously, and somewhere in there is a flaw that's only surfacing now, 3 years after deployment, probably because we've scaled past whatever threshold it was originally designed to handle. Finding the actual error inside that many interacting variables is like finding one wrong digit in a phone book." Vivian looked around the table at 8 brilliant, exhausted faces and felt something close to despair settle into her chest. "Keep working," she said. "I want updates every 30 minutes. I'm not leaving this floor until it's fixed." The room dissolved back into frantic motion. Engineers hunched over laptops, whiteboards filling with equations that meant nothing to Vivian, voices rising and falling in technical arguments she could follow only well enough to understand that nobody actually agreed on what was wrong. She stood near the window, watching it all, feeling more helpless than she had in years. And that was when she noticed, through the glass wall of the conference room, a familiar figure pushing a cart slowly down the hallway outside. Nathan. He was on the wrong floor for his usual rounds, she registered distantly. 39 wasn't on his regular schedule, but someone must have pulled him over to help cover for a colleague who'd called in sick, because there he was, methodically wiping down the glass partition just outside the conference room door, exactly the way he had been the night she'd first approached him 3 weeks earlier. She didn't think much of it at first. Her attention was consumed by the crisis unfolding around her. But 20 minutes later, glancing toward the window during a brief lull in the engineers arguing, she noticed Nathan had stopped working. He was standing perfectly still outside the glass, his cleaning cloth hanging forgotten in one hand, his eyes fixed on the whiteboard inside the conference room, the one covered, edge to edge, in the dense mathematical notation Felix Argent's team had been scrawling and erasing and re-scrawling for the past hour. He was reading it, really reading it, his eyes moving across the equations the way someone reads a paragraph, not the way someone glances at incomprehensible scribbles. His brow furrowed. He took a small step closer to the glass. Vivian watched him for nearly a full minute, her pulse picking up, something electric crawling up her spine. Then she walked to the door and opened it. "Nathan!" He startled, stepping back from the glass like he'd been caught somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. "Sorry, Ms. Sterling, I wasn't trying to... I was just finishing the windows. I didn't mean to... What did you see?" He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "On the board, just now, what did you see?" Inside the conference room, the conversation had stopped. 8 exhausted, frustrated engineers turned to stare at the doorway, at their CEO, at the janitor standing awkwardly in the hallway with a cleaning cloth still in his hand, and Vivian felt the weight of every one of those stares without taking her eyes off Nathan's face. "It's probably nothing," Nathan said quickly. "I shouldn't have been looking. I'll get back to..." "Nathan." Her voice was quiet but absolutely unmovable. "What did you see?" He hesitated, glancing past her into the room, at the whiteboard, at the equations that had occupied 8 brilliant minds for the better part of 3 hours without yielding an answer. Something in his expression shifted, that careful, guarded blankness he'd worn for the past 3 weeks cracking, just slightly, replaced by something sharper, more alive. "There's an asymmetry in your weighting function," he said slowly. "Third line from the top, the term where you're calculating node capacity against incoming load. You've got it set up to treat all 40 variables with equal recalculation priority, but that's not how the system would actually behave under real stress. When load spikes past a certain threshold, some variables need to update faster than others, or the whole model falls out of sync with reality. It's not that the math is wrong, exactly. It's that the math is solving for a static world, and your system isn't static anymore. It hasn't been for a while." Silence. Complete, absolute silence in a room that had been full of arguing voices 30 seconds earlier. Felix Argent stood up slowly from his chair, staring at Nathan with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to hope. "Say that again." "The weighting function," Nathan said, a little more confident now, though his hands had tightened slightly around the cleaning cloth, the only sign of nerves he allowed himself. "You're treating it as a closed system with even distribution. But you scaled the network, 3 times since this was built? Your node count's gone up, but the model's still calculating priority the same way it did at the original scale. Under low traffic, it would never show up. Under high traffic, exactly the kind of traffic you'd see on a Tuesday morning when every client system runs its batch processes at once. The lag between when a node reports it's overloaded and when the model actually redistributes its load gets long enough that the failure outruns the correction. That's your cascade. It's not one broken node. It's the model always being one step behind reality, and the gap getting worse every time a node fails because there's more catching up to do." Renata Cole had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the whiteboard, mentally retracing every line of the equation Nathan had just described. "That's," she started, then stopped, then started again. That would explain why it only surfaced now. "We hit a node count threshold sometime in the last 2 quarters that we never stress tested against." "Can you fix it?" Vivian asked, looking between Nathan and the room full of stunned engineers. "I don't know your full code base," Nathan said carefully. "I can't fix the implementation, but the mathematical correction—" He hesitated, glancing at Vivian, some old instinct of self-preservation visibly warring with something else, something that looked almost like hunger. "The correction itself isn't actually that complicated. If I could just show them," Vivian said. "Whatever you need. Show them." Nathan looked past her into the room one more time, at 8 engineers who had, until 90 seconds ago, regarded him as invisible. A man who emptied trash cans and wiped down glass. Someone whose presence in the hallway barely registered as a presence at all. Now they were staring at him like he might be the only thing standing between them and catastrophe. "Can I borrow a marker?" he said quietly. Felix Argent crossed the room in 3 steps and put a dry erase marker in Nathan's hand like he was passing him something sacred. Then, what happened over the next 40 minutes would become, in the retelling that spread through Sterling Dynamics over the following weeks, the kind of story that got exaggerated and polished with every new person who told it. The janitor who saved the company, the broom-pushing genius, the man who solved in half an hour what 8 PhDs couldn't solve in 5 hours. But the truth, the actual truth of what happened in that conference room was quieter than the legend it became, and somehow more remarkable for it. Nathan didn't walk in and immediately produce a flawless solution. He stood at the whiteboard for the first several minutes simply asking questions. Careful, specific questions about how the system actually behaved, what data the engineers had pulled from the failure logs, how the original weighting function had been derived 5 years earlier. He listened more than he spoke. He let Felix Argent walk him through the architecture, nodding along, occasionally stopping him to ask for clarification on a term or a threshold value, building a working understanding of a system he'd never seen before with the patient. Methodical hunger of someone who had spent 12 years being told his mind didn't have anywhere useful left to go. Then he started writing. It wasn't elegant, not at first. He crossed out 2 false starts, muttering something under his breath, erasing half a line and starting over. Vivian watched him from near the door, watched the way his shoulders had changed, no longer curved inward, no longer braced for criticism, but loose now, absorbed, his whole body angled toward the board like it was the only thing in the room. He looked, for the first time since she'd found him, completely unguarded. "Here," he said finally, tapping the marker against a cluster of symbols near the bottom of the board. "If you introduce a decay function here, weighted toward recency of load data instead of treating every node update as equally current, the model stops lagging behind the actual state of the network. It costs you a little processing overhead, maybe 2%, but it means the system catches the imbalance before it cascades instead of after." Renata leaned forward, eyes scanning the equation with the focused intensity of someone trying to find a flaw and failing to find one. "That's—" She looked up at Felix. "That actually closes the gap. That's the whole problem, right there." "It's not a complete rewrite," Nathan added quickly, almost apologetically, like he was afraid of overstepping again. "You'd still want your engineering team to stress test it properly before deploying to production. I'm just telling you what's broken and roughly what fixes it. The implementation is yours." Felix Argent stared at the whiteboard for a long moment, then turned to look at Nathan with an expression that mixed professional astonishment with something that looked almost like grief. The particular grief of a man realizing how much time had just been wasted, how many hours his team had burned circling a problem that had apparently been visible in less than half an hour to a man none of them had thought to ask. "Who are you?" Felix said, not unkindly, more like he genuinely needed the question answered. "Where did you learn to do this?" Nathan's expression flickered, the openness from a moment ago retreating slightly, replaced by something more careful. "I studied math a long time ago." "A long time ago doesn't explain this," Renata said, gesturing at the board. "This isn't textbook stuff. You just diagnosed a flaw in a 5-year-old production system that 8 senior engineers couldn't find in 5 hours. From outside the glass, in under 2 minutes. "I just saw a pattern," Nathan said quietly. "That's all it was." Vivian watched him deflect, watched him shrink the moment back down to something small and ordinary, and she understood, with a kind of ache she hadn't expected, that this instinct to minimize himself, to apologize for his own brilliance, had become as natural to him as breathing. 12 years of practice had taught him that being extraordinary made people around him uncomfortable, and he had learned, somewhere along the way, to make himself smaller so the discomfort would stop. "Get the implementation team moving," Vivian said, finally stepping forward, her voice cutting cleanly through the moment. "Renata, I want this fix tested and deployed within the hour. Felix, work with Nathan on anything else the engineers need to understand the correction. Everyone else, back to your stations. I want full system monitoring the second this goes live." The room erupted into motion. Engineers who had spent the morning frozen in frustration now moved with renewed urgency. Laptops open, voices overlapping as they began translating Nathan's correction into actual code. Vivian watched it happen for a moment, watched her company's crisis transform, in real time, from catastrophe into a problem that finally had a solution. And then she looked back at Nathan, who was standing a little apart from the controlled chaos, the marker still in his hand, looking almost dazed by what had just happened. "Thank you," she said quietly, close enough that only he could hear it. He looked down at this marker, then back up at her, and for a moment something genuine passed across his face. Not pride, exactly, but a kind of fragile relief, like a man remembering, after a very long time, what it felt like to matter for the right reasons. "I should finish my rounds," he said. "Nathan, please." His voice was quiet but firm. "I don't want this to be a thing." She let him go. She watched him set the marker down carefully on the tray beneath the whiteboard, pick his cleaning cart back up from the hallway, and disappear toward the elevator without another word, and she understood that whatever had just happened in that conference room, it had cost him something to let it happen at all. By 6 o'clock that evening, the fix was live. By 7, every client system had stabilized, the cascading failures had stopped, and the dashboard that had glowed red with errors for most of the day had gone, node by node, back to a steady, reassuring green. Renata Cole sent Vivian a single text message at 7:42. "We're stable. Full system integrity restored. We just dodged the biggest disaster in this company's history." And Vivian read it standing alone in her office, feeling something complicated and heavy settle in her chest, equal parts relief and a fierce, protective anger she hadn't expected. because she already knew, even before it happened, exactly how this was going to play out. By the next morning, word of what had happened in the 39th floor conference room had spread through every department in the building, mutating slightly with each retelling, until half the company believed a janitor had personally rewritten Sterling Dynamics' entire codebase from scratch in under an hour. The other half, the part of the company that had spent 4 hours that morning genuinely terrified for their jobs, watching the value of every client contract they'd helped build threaten to evaporate, felt something closer to gratitude, the kind that didn't care about job titles or pay grades or who was supposed to be allowed to speak in a conference room. But there was a third group, too. A smaller group, quieter, more dangerous. The group that included men like Marcus Webb and, as Vivian would discover within 48 hours, several senior executives who had spent years building careers on being the smartest people in any given room, and who found something deeply, viscerally threatening about the idea that a man in a janitor's uniform had just made all of them look obsolete in front of the company's entire engineering leadership. It was Marcus who filed the first formal complaint, less than 24 hours after the crisis had been resolved, and it landed on Vivian's desk Thursday morning with a subject line that made her blood go cold before she'd even opened it. Protocol violation. Unauthorized staff access to confidential systems information, N. Brooks. She opened it standing up, coffee forgotten on her desk, and read it twice, her hands tightening slightly around the edge of her laptop with each line. The complaint argued, in careful, lawyerly language clearly drafted with input from someone in legal, that Nathan Brooks, a janitorial employee without security clearance, without an NDA covering technical infrastructure, without any formal role granting him access to proprietary system architecture, had been permitted to view and directly interact with confidential company data in violation of at least 3 separate sections of the employee handbook. It suggested, without quite saying it outright, that this represented a serious security risk that the company could not afford to overlook, regardless of the outcome. It was signed by Marcus Webb, but it carried 4 additional signatures beneath his bowl, 4 senior executives, including, Vivian noted with a fresh stab of anger, 2 members of the leadership team who had been in that conference room the previous day, who had watched Nathan save the company in real time and shaken his hand afterward, and who had apparently spent the past 24 hours deciding that gratitude was less useful to their careers than protecting the idea that men like them were supposed to be irreplaceable. She sat very still for a long moment after reading it, feeling something cold and furious settle into the center of her chest, the kind of anger that didn't need to shout to be dangerous. Then she picked up her phone and called Doug in HR. "Tell me you haven't acted on this yet," she said, the moment he picked up. "Ms. Sterling, Doug's voice was hesitant, careful, the voice of a man caught in the middle of something much bigger than his job description. The complaint came through proper channels, signed by 5 senior staff members. Standard procedure would be to open a formal review and, has Nathan Brooks been notified? A pause. This morning. Standard practice is to inform the employee a review is opening and that they may be placed on administrative leave pending. Don't, Vivian said. Don't do anything else until I've spoken with him myself. Is that understood? Yes, but Ms. Sterling, with 5 signatures from senior leadership, if you intervene directly without going through the formal review process, it could look like, I don't care how it looks, Vivian said, and her voice came out harder and colder than she'd intended, hard enough that she heard Doug go quiet on the other end of the line. A man saved this company $300 million yesterday, and this morning 5 executives are trying to punish him for it because it made them feel small. I will deal with this personally. Do not touch his file again until you hear from me. She hung up before Doug could answer and sat alone in her office for a long moment, staring at the email still open on her screen, the 5 signatures lined up at the bottom like a small, cowardly army. She thought about Nathan in that conference room the day before, the careful way he'd deflected every compliment, the speed with which he'd retreated back into invisibility the moment the crisis was solved, the quiet plea in his voice when he'd asked her not to make it into a thing. She understood now, with a clarity that made her chest ache, exactly what he'd been protecting himself from. He hadn't been hiding his intelligence out of modesty. He'd been hiding it because some part of him, some part shaped by years she still didn't fully understand, already knew that being brilliant in the wrong room in front of the wrong people, came with a cost that the people signing this complaint were about to make him pay. She wasn't going to let that happen, not without a fight of her own. She grabbed her coat off the back of her chair and headed for the elevator, already composing in her mind the conversation she was about to have with Marcus Webb, a conversation she intended to make very, very uncomfortable for him. But underneath the anger, underneath the fierce protective instinct driving her down the hallway, there was something else too, something quieter and more frightening. The growing certainty that to truly help Nathan, she was going to have to finally understand what had happened to him 12 years ago. What had taken a man capable of solving in 30 minutes what 8 PhDs couldn't solve in 5 hours, and convinced him the safest place for that mind was behind a mop bucket where no one would ever ask it to matter again. Marcus Webb's office sat on the 38th floor, a glass-walled box with a view of nothing in particular, and when Vivian pushed through his door without knocking, he was halfway through a phone call he ended abruptly, his face shifting through 3 expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, then a kind of practiced composure, then something underneath both that looked almost like fear. "Ms. Sterling, I wasn't expecting 5 signatures," Vivian said, dropping a printed copy of the complaint on his desk. "You got 4 other people to put their names on this. I want to know whose idea it actually was, because I don't believe for a second this came from genuine concern about protocol." Marcus straightened in his chair, reaching for the kind of calm authority he probably practiced in the mirror. "Ms. Sterling, with respect, this isn't personal. We have real obligations around data security and employee classifications. Mr. Brooks does not have clearance to—" "He doesn't have clearance because nobody thought to give a janitor clearance," Vivian said, "not because he doesn't deserve it. There's a difference, Marcus, and I think you know that difference better than anyone in this building right now." "What I know," Marcus said, his voice tightening, "is that we cannot run a company where any employee can wander into a confidential meeting and start rewriting our infrastructure based on what they happen to see through a glass wall. What happens next time, it's not a fix. What happens when someone without proper training makes a change that breaks something worse?" "He didn't make a change," Vivian said. "He pointed at a flaw your own team verified within minutes. He handed the implementation back to your engineers and told them, in his own words, that he didn't know your codebase well enough to touch it himself. That's not someone overstepping his role, Marcus. That's someone being more careful with boundaries than the 5 executives who decided the appropriate response to being saved $300 million was a disciplinary complaint." Marcus's jaw worked for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had dropped the professional veneer just slightly, revealing something raw underneath. "Do you have any idea what it looked like? 8 senior engineers, people with doctorates, standing there speechless while a man in a janitor's uniform solved in 20 minutes what we couldn't solve all morning. You think that doesn't do something to a team? You think Felix Argent is going to walk into that conference room next week and feel like an expert in his own field?" "So this is about how it made people feel," Vivian said quietly. "Not about protocol at all." "It's about both," Marcus snapped, then visibly caught himself exhaling, smoothing his tie in the same automatic gesture Nathan had noticed weeks earlier. "Look, I'm not trying to be the villain here. I'm trying to protect the structure of this company. If we let this slide without any review at all, what message does that send? That anyone can ignore their job description the second they think they know better?" "The message it sends," Vivian said, leaning forward, both hands flat on his desk, "is that talent matters more than title in this building. And if that message terrifies you, Marcus, I think that tells me a great deal more about you than it does about Nathan Brooks." She left him sitting there, his face flushed, the printed complaint still on his desk, and rode the elevator down to the 30th floor with her heart hammering, anger and something close to grief tangled together in her chest. She found Nathan in the supply closet near the east stairwell, restocking shelves with the same careful, methodical focus he brought to everything, and when he saw her face, he set the box down immediately. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing's happened yet," she said. "But I need you to know there's a complaint. Marcus and 4 others are pushing for a formal review on the grounds that you violated protocol yesterday." Something closed in Nathan's expression. Not surprise, she noticed, but a kind of weary recognition, like a man watching weather he'd been expecting arrive exactly on schedule. "Of course there is," he said quietly. "I'm not going to let it stand." "Vivian." He said her name carefully, the way he always did now, like he was choosing each word with deliberate restraint. You don't need to fight this battle for me. I should have just kept walking yesterday. I should have minded my own business. You saved this company $300 million. I made 5 very powerful people feel small, he said. In my experience, that costs more than it's worth, no matter how much money is on the table. He picked the box back up, returning to his work with a steadiness that felt, to Vivian, less like calm and more like resignation. I'll talk to HR. I'll apologize for overstepping. It'll blow over. Why do you do that? Vivian said, and the question came out sharper than she intended, edged with 3 weeks of frustration she hadn't fully let herself feel until now. Why do you keep shrinking yourself down every single time something good happens to you? You're the smartest person I've ever met, Nathan, and you act like that's something you have to apologize for. He went very still, a can of cleaning solution suspended halfway to the shelf, and for a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful neutrality, replaced by something raw, something that sounded like it had been buried for a long time, and was only now, reluctantly, surfacing. Because the last time I let myself believe being smart meant anything, he said, it cost me everything that mattered. He set the can down on the shelf, his hand lingering there for a moment, and Vivian watched something old and painful move across his face before he caught himself and pulled the careful mask back into place. I should finish my shift, he said. Nathan, please, talk to me. Not here, he said, glancing toward the open door of the closet, toward the hallway beyond it, where anyone could walk past. Not like this. God. She didn't push him that night. But 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, when she should have been at a board luncheon she'd quietly canceled, Vivian found herself sitting in her car outside a small rented house on a quiet street 23 minutes from downtown, the address pulled from his personnel file with a guilt she didn't entirely manage to talk herself out of. She told herself she wasn't there to interrogate him. She told herself she just wanted to understand, finally, the shape of the life that had swallowed 12 years of his brilliance whole. She almost didn't knock. She sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes, watching the small front yard, a tricycle on its side near the porch steps, a chalk drawing half washed away by recent rain, the unmistakable evidence of a child's life layered over everything, before she finally got out and walked up the path. Nathan opened the door wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt, looking younger somehow without the gray uniform, and his expression when he saw her shifted rapidly from confusion to something wary. Vivian, what are you doing here? I'm sorry, she said immediately. I know this is overstepping. I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about it costing you everything. I wanted to understand, not as your boss, as someone who used to know you, who maybe never really knew you at all. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, and she watched him war with himself, watched the urge to close the door gently and politely against some older, more exhausted urge to finally let someone see the whole picture. Behind him, a small voice called out, "Daddy, who is it?" A girl appeared at his side, maybe 8 years old, dark curly hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, regarding Vivian with the open, unguarded curiosity only children seem to have left. "Hi," she said. "Are you Daddy's friend?" "This is Emma," Nathan said, something in his voice softening instantly, the exhaustion in his shoulders easing just slightly at the sight of her. "Emma, this is Ms. Sterling. She's someone I used to know a long time ago." "You have a pretty coat," Emma said, eyeing Vivian's jacket with frank appraisal. "Thank you," Vivian said, and found herself smiling despite everything, despite the tension still humming underneath the moment. "I like your chalk drawing on the porch." "It's a dinosaur," Emma said. "It got rained on." "Emma, go finish your snack, okay? I'll be just outside for a few minutes." The girl disappeared back into the house, and Nathan stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind him, leaving just enough gap to hear if she called. He sat down heavily on the top step, and after a moment Vivian sat beside him, close enough to talk quietly, far enough to give him room. "She's beautiful," Vivian said. "She's everything," Nathan said simply, and the way he said it carried the weight of an entire decade. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the small, ordinary street, and then he started talking, slowly at first, like a man testing whether the ground beneath an old wound could hold his weight. "You remember my parents," he said. "You met them once, I think, graduation weekend." "I remember," Vivian said softly. "Your mother cried during the ceremony. Your father kept telling everyone you were going to change mathematics forever." Something flickered across Nathan's face, pain wrapped tight around an old, faded warmth. 6 months after graduation, my mother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. Aggressive progression, the kind doctors don't sugarcoat for you. My father had a stroke 4 months after that, lost most of the use of his right side. They were 63 and 65. They'd put everything they had into making sure I could go to college, work 2 jobs each while I was growing up so I wouldn't have student debt. And the second I was supposed to start paying it forward, start the doctoral fellowship, start the life they'd sacrificed for, they both needed someone to take care of them full-time, and there wasn't anyone else. "You didn't have siblings," Vivian said quietly. It wasn't a question. She remembered that much. "No, just me." He rubbed a hand across his jaw, staring out at nothing. "I deferred the fellowship for 1 year, told myself I'd get them stabilized, find proper care, and start the following fall. But proper care costs money we didn't have, and the kind of care insurance actually covers isn't the kind of care that keeps 2 sick people comfortable and dignified in their final years. So I deferred again, and again. And somewhere in there, I met Rachel." He stopped, and Vivian watched something complicated move across his face. Grief layered over grief, old enough now to have gone quiet, but clearly never fully healed. "Emma's mother," Vivian said gently. "Emma's mother," Nathan confirmed. "We weren't married long. 18 months maybe, before Emma was born, and then about a year after that before she decided she hadn't actually signed up for the life I was living. 2 dying parents in the house, no money, no future that looked like anything she'd imagined for herself. She left when Emma was 14 months old. Custody wasn't even a fight. She didn't want it." His voice had gone flat, the particular flatness of someone reciting facts they'd worked very hard to stop feeling. "So it was me. 2 parents who needed round-the-clock care, and a daughter who needed everything a baby needs, and a fellowship offer that quietly expired somewhere in year 3 because nobody holds a position open that long, no matter how promising you once were." "Nathan," Vivian's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. Why didn't you ever reach out? Any of us would have—" "What would you have done?" he asked, not unkindly, just tired. Half the people from school had already started their own careers, their own lives. I wasn't going to call up old classmates and ask for money to cover a hospice bill, and honestly— He paused, something almost embarrassed crossing his face. "I was ashamed. Isn't that stupid? I was ashamed that the life everyone predicted for me had turned into changing my father's bed sheets and trying to remember if I'd paid the gas bill. I stopped answering emails. I stopped going to anything. It was easier to disappear than to explain." "It's not stupid," Vivian said. "It's not stupid at all." "My mother died first," Nathan continued, his voice steady now in the particular way of someone who had told this story to himself so many times in the dark that the words had worn smooth. 6 years ago. My father held on another 2 years after that, but the stroke had taken so much of him by the end, some days he didn't know who I was. I was working overnight shifts at a warehouse during that whole stretch, because it was the only job that let me sleep during the day, when a home health aide could cover the hours I couldn't. I'd come home at 6 in the morning, relieve the aide, get Emma up and ready for school, sit with my father until the aide came back at 3, sleep for maybe 4 hours, and do it all again. "And the math," Vivian said quietly. "What happened to the math?" Nathan let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it at all. "The math never left," he said. "That's the part nobody understands. I didn't lose the ability. I lost the time, the money, the institutional doors that close behind you the longer you're gone. By the time my father passed 2.5 years ago, Emma was 6. I had no savings, no professional network that still remembered my name for anything other than the guy who used to be promising. And every entry point back into academic or research work required either connections I'd burned through neglect or money I didn't have to go back to school and update credentials that had gone stale. I tried. For about 8 months after he died, I genuinely tried. Applied everywhere, got exactly nowhere. Turns out a 10-year gap with no publications doesn't read as devoted caregiver to a hiring committee. It just reads as a gap. So you stopped trying. I stopped trying to go back, he corrected gently. I didn't stop the math. I do it every night after Emma's asleep. Problems I read about online, old competition questions, sometimes things I make up myself just to see if I still can. It's not for anyone. It's not going anywhere, it's just... He hesitated, searching for the right word. It's mine. It's the one part of who I used to be that nobody could take from me, even when everything else got taken. I don't need a department or a salary to prove it still matters. It matters because I do it. Vivian sat with that for a long moment, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the small yard, the faded chalk dinosaur slowly disappearing under another light drizzle that had started without either of them noticing. She thought about the notebook he'd snapped shut in the break room weeks earlier, hiding it not out of shame, but out of some deeper instinct to protect the one thing that still belonged only to him. That night I found you in the break room, she said. You weren't hiding the math from me because you were ashamed of it. I was hiding it because it's the only thing I have left that isn't already spoken for, Nathan said. Emma needs a father. The job needs an employee. The world's needed 100 different versions of me my whole life, and somewhere in all of it, the part of me that used to dream about proving things just for the joy of proving them got pushed down to 11 o'clock at night after everyone else's needs were met. I guard that hour pretty fiercely. I think you can understand why. I do, Vivian said softly. I really do. They sat in silence for a while, rain ticking softly against the porch roof, and finally Nathan spoke again, quieter this time. I'm telling you all this because I trust you, Vivian. I always did, even back then. But I need you to understand something. I'm not looking to be rescued. I'm not some tragedy waiting for a billionaire to swoop in and fix. I built a life. It's small, and it's not what anyone expected of me, but it's mine. And Emma's safe, and most nights, that's enough. I'm not trying to rescue you, Vivian said, though even as she said it, she wasn't entirely certain it was true. I just think the world owes you a little more than it's given you. And I don't think you should have to apologize for being brilliant just because brilliance got complicated for you. He looked at her then, something unguarded flickering across his face, 12 years of careful walls thinning just slightly in the gray afternoon light. Thank you, he said, for listening. Most people just want the short version. I don't want the short version of you, Vivian said. I never did, said. The complaint against him moved forward anyway, regardless of what had passed between them on that porch. 2 weeks later, after Vivian had spent every spare hour fighting it through every internal channel she could find, pulling rank where rank mattered, calling in favors where it didn't, personally reviewing the employee handbook line by line to prove the so-called violation was, at best, a generous interpretation of vague language nobody had ever enforced before, the board scheduled a formal session to review the matter, and that was when everything truly began to unravel. She hadn't expected the board to take it seriously. Sterling Dynamics' board was composed mostly of investors and longtime advisors who cared primarily about returns, and she'd assumed the entire complaint would die quietly once she made clear how absurd it looked from the outside. 5 executives disciplining the man who'd just saved their largest contracts. But Marcus Webb, it turned out, had spent the 2 weeks building a coalition, framing the issue not as gratitude versus punishment, but as precedent versus chaos, and 2 board members who'd been quietly uneasy about Vivian's increasingly hands-on management style saw an opportunity to make a larger point about authority and process. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Vivian walked in prepared to fight, prepared to lay out every argument she'd built over 2 weeks, and found instead an empty chair where Nathan's name had been listed as a required attendee. "Where is he?" she asked, scanning the room. Doug, sitting near the back with a folder clutched against his chest, looked uncomfortable. "Miss Sterling, he submitted his resignation this morning." The words landed like a physical blow. "What?" "Effective immediately," Doug said, sliding a single printed page across the table toward her. He came in before his shift, handed it to HR personally, and left. He said, Doug hesitated, glancing around the room before lowering his voice. He said he didn't want to be the reason this company got dragged into political conflict. He said it wasn't worth it. Vivian stared at the letter, 2 short paragraphs in handwriting she recognized instantly. Neat, careful, deliberate. The same handwriting from 100 old notebook pages she'd watched him scribble across in a library more than a decade ago. I'm grateful for the opportunity Sterling Dynamics gave me, and I have no hard feelings toward anyone involved. I think it's best for everyone if I step away quietly rather than create further disruption. Please give my sincerest thanks to Vivian for everything. She read it twice, feeling something hot and furious rise in her chest, directed at Marcus, at the 4 cowardly signatures beneath his complaint, at a system that had taught a brilliant, decent man that the safest, kindest thing he could do for the people around him was disappear before he became inconvenient. "This meeting is over," she said, standing so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "There's nothing left to review. The employee in question has resigned." "Miss Sterling," one of the board members started, "I think it's still worth discussing the broader policy implications of—" "No," Vivian said, already gathering her things, her voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. "It's not. I have somewhere I need to be." She left the boardroom without waiting for a response, walked straight to the elevator, and called Priya from the lobby, her voice tight with an urgency she didn't bother hiding. "I need Nathan Brooks's home address pulled up right now, and I need you to find out if anyone's seen him leave the building today." "Vivian, what's happening?" "He resigned," Vivian said, already pushing through the building's front doors into the gray afternoon air. "He thinks disappearing quietly protects me from this mess. I have to find him before he decides this is final." She drove the 23 minutes to his house faster than she should have, rehearsing what she'd say the entire way, certain only that she could not let this be how it ended. Not after everything she just learned on that porch. Not after 12 years of silence that had already cost them both more than either of them had ever admitted out loud. When she pulled up outside the small rented house, the porch light was on despite the early hour, and through the front window she could see a familiar shape moving in the kitchen. And for the first time in 2 weeks of fighting, of digging, of slowly uncovering the truth of everything he'd survived, Vivian Sterling felt something steady itself in her chest. She got out of the car, walked up the same path she'd walked 2 weeks earlier, and knocked on the door, ready, finally, to refuse losing him a second time. Nathan opened the door before she'd even finished knocking, like he'd heard the car pull up and known, somehow, exactly who it would be. He stood there in the doorway with the dish towel still slung over one shoulder, surprise and something more guarded moving across his face in quick succession. "Vivian, I figured you'd hear by now." "You resigned," she said, and she didn't bother softening the accusation in her voice. "You didn't even talk to me first." "There wasn't anything to talk about," he said quietly. "The board was going to make a decision either way, and I wasn't going to let you spend political capital protecting a janitor when you've got a company to run. It's not worth it, Vivian." "It is to me." She stepped closer, close enough that he had to look directly at her instead of past her toward the street. "You don't get to decide what's worth fighting for on my behalf. I've spent 2 weeks digging through company policy, calling in favors, going line by line through an employee handbook nobody's read properly in 5 years, and you walked in this morning and threw it all away in about 90 seconds because you'd rather disappear quietly than let anyone fight for you. That's not noble, Nathan. That's a habit, and I think you know that." He flinched just slightly, like the words had landed somewhere true and uncomfortable. "Vivian? Daddy?" Emma's voice came from somewhere behind him, small and uncertain. "Is everything okay?" Nathan turned, his whole posture softening instantly. "It's fine, sweetheart. Go finish your homework, okay? I'll be right there." The girl disappeared back into the house, and Nathan stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door mostly shut behind him the same way he had 2 weeks earlier, like some instinct in him needed to keep these two parts of his life carefully separated. "Can I come in?" Vivian said, quieter now. "Just for a few minutes. I want to show you something, and I'd rather not do it standing on your front step." He hesitated, then nodded, and led her inside to a small, tidy living room. A couch that had clearly seen better days but was covered in a soft blanket. a bookshelf crammed with children's books and a handful of worn paperbacks, a single framed photo on the side table of Nathan holding a much younger Emma, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. It was a modest home, lived in carefully, the kind of space that told the story of someone stretching every dollar as far as it could go without ever letting his daughter feel the strain of it. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the couch, and disappeared briefly into the kitchen. Returning a moment later with 2 mugs of coffee, he sat down on the small table between them, an old habit of hospitality that seemed to survive even now. "I went back to your house 2 weeks ago," Vivian said, once he'd sat down across from her. "After our conversation on the porch, I couldn't stop thinking about everything you told me, and I want to be honest with you about something, because I think you deserve honesty more than anyone I've ever met." Nathan watched her carefully, saying nothing, his hands wrapped around the warm mug like it gave him something to hold on to. "I asked Priya to track down your old neighbor," Vivian continued, "the one who used to help with your father sometimes, before the home health aide started coming. Mrs. Alvarez. She still lives 2 doors down from your old place." Something shifted in Nathan's expression, wariness sharpening. "Why would you do that?" "Because I needed to understand," Vivian said. "Not just the facts, the whole picture. And she told me things, Nathan, that you didn't tell me on that porch. She told me about the nights she'd see your kitchen light still on at 2, 3 in the morning, long after your father had finally fallen asleep. She told me she used to bring you coffee sometimes because she could see how exhausted you were, and you'd always thank her and then go right back to whatever you were working on at that table. She said she asked you once what you were doing up so late, and you told her you were just keeping your mind sharp." Nathan's jaw tightened. He looked down at his coffee, saying nothing. "She showed me something else too," Vivian said, more gently now. "She said when your father passed, you asked if she'd hold on to a box of your things for a while because you were downsizing and didn't have room. You never went back for it. She still has it. She let me look through it, with her permission, because I told her I was trying to understand an old friend who'd disappeared on me, and I think some part of her wanted someone to finally see what was in there." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn, spiral-bound notebook, its cover soft and curling at the corners, the same kind of notebook she'd seen him hide in the break room weeks earlier, except older, more worn, clearly one of many. "This isn't the only one," she said quietly, setting it on the table between them. "There were 11 of these in that box, Nathan. 11 notebooks going back 9 years. Pages and pages of proofs, half-finished theorems, problems you made up yourself just to solve them, notes in the margins about ideas you wanted to come back to. I sat in my car outside Mrs. Alvarez's house for 2 hours reading through them. And I want you to know, I'm not a mathematician. I couldn't follow most of what's actually written on these pages. But I understood enough to see what it meant that you never stopped. Not once. Not through years of caregiving, not through losing both your parents, not through being abandoned by Emma's mother, not through years of warehouse shifts and delivery routes and overnight security jobs. You never stopped being exactly who you always were. You just stopped letting anyone see it." Nathan stared at the notebook on the table like it was something dangerous, something he wasn't sure he was ready to touch. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough. "You shouldn't have gone digging through my things, Vivian." "Maybe not," she admitted. "But I'm not sorry I did. Because I think you've spent so long convincing yourself that the math was just a private comfort, just something small you allowed yourself at the end of exhausting days, that you've forgotten what it actually is. This isn't a hobby, Nathan. Mrs. Alvarez doesn't understand a word of what's in these pages. And even she could tell you that what you were doing at that kitchen table at 2 in the morning wasn't relaxation. It was work, real work. The kind of work that doesn't stop just because the world decided it didn't have room for you anymore." He picked up the notebook with hands that weren't quite steady, opening it slowly, flipping through pages of his own handwriting like he was reading a letter from a man he barely remembered being. His eyes moved across proofs he'd worked out alone in the dark, year after year, with no audience, no deadline, no reward beyond the simple fact of having solved something difficult and true. "I told myself it didn't matter," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That it was just something I did to stay sane, that it wasn't really anything." "It's everything," Vivian said. "And I think some part of you has always known that, even when you were telling yourself otherwise. You didn't give up on the math, Nathan. You just gave up on the idea that the world would ever let you do it somewhere other than a kitchen table at midnight. He closed the notebook slowly, holding it against his chest for a moment like something fragile. And when he looked up at her, his eyes were wet. 12 years of carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of being truly seen. I don't know how to want that life back, he admitted. I stopped letting myself want it a long time ago. It felt safer. I know, Vivian said softly. But you don't have to figure that out alone anymore. Let me fight for you, not because I pity you and not because of who you used to be to me, because what you did in that conference room wasn't luck, and it wasn't a fluke, and the world deserves to see what you're actually capable of, even if it terrifies a handful of insecure executives along the way. She didn't get a promise from him that night. He needed time, he said. Time to think. Time to talk to Emma about what any of this might mean for the careful, contained life they'd built together. Vivian respected that, left the notebook with him, and drove back to her apartment with a fierce, simmering resolve that hadn't existed in her 2 weeks earlier. A determination not just to fix one unfair complaint, but to make sure the entire culture that had produced it answered for what it had nearly cost. The board meeting she called 3 days later wasn't on anyone's calendar, and she made sure of that deliberately. She wanted no warning, no time for Marcus Webb and his coalition to rehearse their defense, no opportunity to spin the narrative before she'd had the chance to lay out every piece of evidence she'd spent the better part of 3 weeks assembling. She walked into the boardroom at 9 in the morning with a folder thick enough to make several board members exchange uneasy glances, and she didn't sit down right away. She stood at the head of the table, exactly where Renata Cole had stood 3 weeks earlier, delivering news of catastrophe, and she let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone in the room to understand this wasn't a routine session. 3 weeks ago, she began, this company came within hours of triggering breach of contract penalties with 11 major clients, with conservative damage estimates north of $300 million. I want everyone in this room to remember exactly how that morning felt, because I think some of you have already conveniently forgotten. She clicked through a presentation she'd built the night before, timestamps from the system failure, the cascading errors across client dashboards, Renata's own panicked internal messages from that morning, all of it laid out in stark, undeniable detail. Then she pulled up a photo of the whiteboard from the conference room, the dense cluster of equations Nathan had written in under 30 minutes, still legible enough to read clearly. This is the correction that stopped the cascade, she said, written by a man with a security badge that says Facilities Janitorial Services. A man who 8 senior engineers will confirm diagnosed in under 2 minutes a flaw their team had spent 5 hours failing to locate. A man who then explicitly deferred the actual implementation to your engineering staff, made no claim to ownership over the fix, asked for no compensation, and went back to emptying trash cans the moment the crisis ended. She let that sit in the room for a moment before continuing. And 4 days later, 5 of you signed a formal complaint accusing that same man of a protocol violation serious enough to warrant disciplinary review. She pulled up the complaint itself, Marcus's careful legal language displayed on the screen for the entire board to see. I want to read you the actual substance of this complaint because I think it's important everyone hears it stated plainly. It does not allege that Nathan Brooks caused any harm. It does not allege that he accessed any system without authorization. It alleges that he was present in a hallway, observed information visible through a glass wall, and offered a correct solution to a crisis his employer was, at that moment, desperately trying to solve. That is the entire substance of this complaint. Marcus shifted in his seat, his face reddening slightly, but he said nothing, and Vivian pressed forward. I've spent the past 3 weeks learning who Nathan Brooks actually is, she continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge now that hadn't been there before. Top of his graduating class in applied mathematics, offered a fully funded doctoral fellowship at one of the most competitive programs in the country. He deferred that fellowship to care for both of his parents through terminal illnesses, his mother through Parkinson's, his father through a debilitating stroke, while simultaneously raising his daughter alone after her mother left when the child was barely a year old. He spent nearly a decade as a full-time caregiver, working overnight shifts at warehouses and delivery jobs to support his family because there was no one else.
and by the time both his parents had passed, every door that had once been open to him had quietly closed. Not because his mind had dulled, because the world doesn't keep doors open for people who disappear into responsibility for 10 years, no matter how brilliant they once were. She set down 11 worn notebooks on the boardroom table, one by one, the sound of each landing against the wood the only noise in the otherwise silent room. "These span 9 years," she said. 9 years of a man who lost every external reason to keep doing advanced mathematics, and did it anyway, alone, after midnight, for no audience and no reward, because it was simply who he was. I am not going to stand in front of this board and pretend that man committed some grave violation by pointing at a math error that was actively threatening to cost this company hundreds of millions of dollars.
I think the actual violation happened on the other side of that complaint, and I think every person who signed it owes Nathan Brooks an apology, starting with the person who initiated it. Marcus finally spoke, his voice tight. "Ms. Sterling, I don't think anyone here is disputing that what he did was impressive. The concern was always about precedent and process, not the concern," Vivian cut in, "was that a janitor made you look replaceable in front of your own team, and you couldn't tolerate it. I reviewed the security footage from outside that conference room, Marcus. I reviewed the timeline of every message exchanged in the company group chat in the 24 hours after the crisis was resolved. I know this complaint wasn't born out of genuine concern for protocol. It was born out of wounded pride, and you found 4 other people willing to attach their names to it because wounded pride travels well in groups. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. One of the board members, an older woman named Eleanor Whitfield Hayes, who'd sat largely quiet through the entire presentation, finally cleared her throat. "Ms. Sterling, what exactly are you proposing we do?" "3 things," Vivian said, turning to face the full table. "First, the complaint against Nathan Brooks is dismissed in its entirety, and a formal record is entered clarifying that his actions during the system failure represented exemplary conduct, not a violation. Second, I'm recommending the immediate termination of Marcus Webb's employment, effective today, for conduct unbecoming a manager and for fostering a culture of retaliation against an employee who exposed leadership's own technical shortcomings." A ripple moved through the room. Marcus's face had gone pale. "Sterling, you cannot just—" "I can," Vivian said simply, "and I am. Third, I am personally extending Nathan Brooks an offer to return to Sterling Dynamics in a newly created role, Senior Problem-Solving Consultant, reporting directly to our CTO, with responsibility for advanced systems troubleshooting and engineering training across all technical divisions. The compensation will reflect the actual value of what he brings to this company, not what a job title from a uniform suggested he was worth." She looked around the table, meeting eyes one by one, daring anyone to object. No one did. "This board exists to protect the long-term value of this company," she said, her voice softening just slightly, though the steel underneath it never fully disappeared. "I'd argue the single greatest threat to that value isn't some janitor who happened to be brilliant. It's a culture where talent gets punished the moment it threatens someone's ego. If we let that culture stand, we will lose people like Nathan Brooks every single time we're lucky enough to find them, and we will deserve every disaster that follows." The board voted that afternoon, and it wasn't close. Marcus Webb's termination was approved unanimously, including, notably, by 2 of the 4 executives who had originally signed the complaint alongside him, both of whom seemed visibly relieved to distance themselves from a decision they'd clearly come to regret the moment Vivian laid out the full picture. She drove to Nathan's house that evening, the offer letter sitting on the passenger seat beside her, freshly printed, Renata Cole's signature already on it alongside Vivian's own. She found him in the front yard this time, sitting on the porch steps while Emma rode her bicycle in slow, wobbly circles around the small front lawn, training wheels still attached, her laughter carrying clear and bright through the evening air. "Vivian?" He stood as she approached, something cautious in his expression, like he wasn't sure yet whether she was bringing good news or bad. "What happened?" "Marcus Webb no longer works at Sterling Dynamics," she said. "The complaint against you has been formally dismissed and entered into the record as the opposite of what it claimed to be." Relief moved across his face, quiet and genuine. "Thank you. I mean that. You didn't have to fight that hard for me. I wasn't finished, she said, and held out the offer letter. I want you to read this before you say anything. He took it, unfolding it slowly, and she watched his eyes move down the page, watched the moment he reached the job title, the moment he reached the salary figure that was nearly 4 times what he'd been making as a janitor, the moment he reached the description of a role built entirely around the thing he'd spent 12 years convincing himself the world no longer had room for. He didn't say anything for a long time. He sat back down on the porch step, the letter held loosely in his hands, staring out at his daughter circling the small front yard on her bicycle, her laughter rising and falling like the only sound that mattered in the whole world. "Daddy, watch this!" Emma called, attempting a wobbly, overconfident turn that nearly sent her into the grass before she caught her balance, giggling at her own near disaster. "I see you, sweetheart," Nathan called back, and there was something in his voice, some thread of emotion he was visibly working to keep steady. "You don't have to decide tonight," Vivian said softly, sitting down beside him. "I know this is a lot. I know it's not the quiet, controlled life you told me you wanted 3 weeks ago." "It's not," he agreed quietly. "But maybe that's not actually what I wanted. Maybe it was just what felt safe to want, after everything." He looked down at the letter again, his thumb tracing absently along the edge of the page. "I'm scared, Vivian. If I take this and it falls apart somehow, if I disappoint everyone, if I can't actually live up to whatever they're imagining, I don't just lose a job. Emma loses stability. I can't risk that on a feeling." "You're not risking it on a feeling," Vivian said. "You're risking it on 11 years of evidence, 11 notebooks full of proof that you never lost what made you exceptional. You just lost the room to use it. I'm offering you the room back." He was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma make another wobbly loop around the yard, the late evening light turning everything gold and soft around them. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Anything. Why does this matter so much to you? Why have you spent 3 weeks fighting this hard for a janitor you hadn't spoken to in 12 years? Vivian considered the question carefully, choosing her answer with the same deliberate honesty she'd promised him on his porch 3 weeks earlier. "Because I watched the world decide you didn't matter anymore. And I watched you start to believe it too. And I think that's one of the saddest things I've ever seen, Nathan. Not the hardship. People survive hardship. But watching someone convince themselves that surviving is all they're allowed to do, when there was always so much more in them than survival." She paused, her voice softening further. "And honestly, selfishly, I think some part of me never stopped believing in who you were back in that lecture hall. I just didn't expect it would take 12 years and a corporate disaster to find out I was right." He looked at her then, something unguarded and grateful and a little overwhelmed all moving across his face at once. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The only sound in the yard, the soft creak of bicycle wheels, and Emma's continued narration of her own writing progress. "Okay," Nathan said finally, quietly. "Okay, I'll do it." Vivian let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Yeah?" "Yeah." He looked back toward Emma, watching her circle the yard one more time, and something settled in his expression. Not certainty exactly, but the beginning of it, the first tentative shape of a future he'd stopped letting himself imagine a long time ago. "I want to build something for her, something better than survival. I think maybe it's time I let myself try." "Daddy!" Emma called out, finally breaking to a wobbly stop in front of the porch. "Can Miss Sterling stay for dinner? We're having spaghetti." Nathan laughed, a real laugh, the first one Vivian had heard from him since she'd found his name on that personnel file weeks earlier, and it changed his whole face, peeled back 12 years in an instant. "What do you say, Vivian? You up for spaghetti?" "I'd love that," Vivian said, surprised by how much she meant it. They went inside together, the offer letter left folded on the porch step behind them, and somewhere in that small, ordinary kitchen, over a pot of boiling water and a jar of store-bought sauce, Emma insisted on stirring herself. Vivian Sterling understood that she hadn't just rescued a brilliant man from obscurity. She had, in some quiet, accidental way, found her way back to someone she should never have let disappear in the first place. And watching Nathan crouch down to wipe a smudge of sauce off his daughter's cheek, laughing softly at something only the two of them found funny,
She felt something settle into place in her chest that had been unsettled for 12 long years. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available.
Nathan's first day back at Sterling Dynamics fell on a Monday, 3 weeks after that spaghetti dinner in the small kitchen with the chalk dinosaur still half visible on the porch outside. And he stood in front of the building that morning wearing a suit Vivian had quietly arranged to have tailored for him, feeling, he admitted to her later, more nervous than he'd felt on any exam day in college. "You don't have to give some big speech," he told her in the elevator, adjusting his collar for the third time. "I just want to do the work. I don't need a parade." "It's not a parade," Vivian said. "It's a correction. There's a difference." She'd called an all-hands meeting for 9 that morning. Every employee who could fit into the main atrium summoned down from their floors, the rest watching on screens piped through to conference rooms across the building. Renata Cole stood near the front with Felix Argent and the rest of the engineering team that had spent that catastrophic Tuesday morning paralyzed in front of a whiteboard, and scattered through the crowd were faces Nathan recognized from his months pushing a cleaning cart through these same halls. People who used to nod politely at him in passing, who'd had no idea what he carried inside him until the day the company nearly burned down around them. Vivian stood at the front of the atrium without notes, without a podium, just her in a room full of 4,000 employees waiting to hear why they'd all been pulled away from their desks. 6 weeks ago, she began, this company came within hours of losing $300 million and very likely several of our most important client relationships, because of a flaw none of our most credentialed engineers could find. It was found and fixed by a man wearing a janitor's uniform. A man most of you walked past in hallways for months without a second glance because his job title told you everything you thought you needed to know about what he was capable of. A murmur moved through the crowd, heads turning, searching for the man being described. "I want to be honest with all of you about something," Vivian continued, "because I think this company owes you honesty, not just a polished story. When Nathan Brooks solved that crisis, the response from several members of this company's leadership wasn't gratitude. It was a formal complaint, accusing him of overstepping his role. Some of the very people in this room watched a man save their jobs, and their first instinct afterward was to punish him for it, because his brilliance made them uncomfortable with their own position in this company's hierarchy." The room had gone very quiet now, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they're hearing something true they hadn't expected to be said out loud. "That complaint has been dismissed," Vivian said. "The employee who initiated it no longer works here. And starting today, Nathan Brooks returns to Sterling Dynamics not as facilities staff, but as our senior problem-solving consultant, reporting directly to our CTO, responsible for training engineering teams across every division in this building." She paused, scanning the crowd until she found him standing near the back, half hidden, looking like he very much wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. "I'm not telling you this story because I want to embarrass anyone, or because I think this company needs a hero narrative. I'm telling you because I think every single person in this room needs to hear it. Talent doesn't always look the way we expect it to look. It doesn't always come with the right degree on the wall, or the right title on a badge, or the right history that fits neatly into a resume. Sometimes it's quietly mopping a floor at 11 o'clock at night, carrying more weight than any of us will ever fully understand. And the only thing standing between that talent and the rest of the world is whether or not someone bothers to actually look." She found Nathan's eyes across the crowded atrium, and something passed between them that didn't need words. "Character matters more than status in this company," she said, turning back to address the full room. "It always should have. From today forward, I intend to make sure it actually does. That's not just a value statement for a company handbook nobody reads. That's a promise. And I expect every leader in this building to be held to it." She stepped back from where she'd been standing and gestured toward him. "Nathan, would you like to say anything?" He hadn't expected to be asked. She watched him hesitate, glance toward the sea of faces all suddenly turned toward him, his hands tightening slightly at his sides the way they always did when he was about to push past some old, deep instinct to disappear. Then, slowly, he made his way to the front of the room and stood where Vivian had been standing, looking out at 4,000 people who, 6 weeks earlier, hadn't known his name. "I'm not good at speeches," he admitted, and a small, warm laugh moved through the crowd, easing some of the tension in the room. "I'm better with numbers. Numbers don't care who you are or what you're wearing when you write them down. They're either right or they're not."
He paused, gathering himself.
For a long time, I believed that the world worked the same way numbers do. That if you were right, if you worked hard, if you did the honest thing, eventually it would matter. And then life happened, the way it happens to a lot of people in this room, probably more of you than anyone talks about openly. I lost both my parents to illness while I was raising my daughter alone. And somewhere in the middle of all that, every door I thought was waiting for me quietly closed, one at a time, until the only work left was the kind nobody asked questions about. And I want to say something to anyone standing in this room who's ever felt invisible in a place like this, felt like their job title decided how much of them anyone was willing to see. He looked out across the crowd, and Vivian watched something steady itself in him. Watched 12 years of carefully managed smallness finally give way to something closer to the man she remembered from a lecture hall a lifetime ago. "You are not the title on your badge," he said. "I spent a long time believing I was, because it was easier than believing the world had simply stopped looking. But somebody looked. And I want every person in this room, whatever job you're doing right now, to know that what you're capable of doesn't disappear just because nobody's noticed it yet. Don't let it disappear because you've stopped believing it's there." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm grateful for this opportunity. I don't take it lightly, and I intend to spend it making sure nobody else in this company has to wait 12 years and a system failure for someone to finally see what they're actually made of." The applause that followed wasn't polite, performative applause. It rolled through the atrium in a genuine wave. Employees from every floor, every department, clapping not because they were told to, but because something in what he'd said had landed somewhere true in nearly all of them. The universal, quiet fear of being underestimated, of being reduced to a job description, of mattering less than you actually do. The weeks that followed weren't a fairy tale, and Vivian made sure of that deliberately, because she understood, better than most, that the most dangerous thing you could do to a man like Nathan was hand him a perfect, frictionless redemption arc that bore no resemblance to how real life actually worked. He struggled, at first, with the rhythms of corporate culture he'd been away from for over a decade. Calendar invites that meant nothing, meetings that existed only to schedule other meetings, the particular performative confidence some engineers wore like armor even when they weren't sure of an answer. He found it exhausting some days, told Vivian honestly during a quiet lunch in her office that he sometimes missed the simplicity of pushing a cart down an empty hallway. No politics, no expectations beyond a clean floor. "That's allowed," she told him. "You don't have to love every part of it. You just have to decide it's worth it." "It is," he said, and meant it, even on the hard days. Felix Argent became, somewhat unexpectedly, one of Nathan's closest allies inside the company. The senior architect's initial astonishment in that conference room had matured into genuine respect, and the two of them spent hours together over the following months, Nathan walking him and the rest of the engineering team through not just the specific fix from that catastrophic Tuesday, but the deeper mathematical thinking behind it, the kind of pattern recognition that came from someone who'd spent a decade solving problems purely for the love of solving them, with nothing riding on the outcome except his own quiet satisfaction. "You think differently than the rest of us," Felix told him one evening. The two of them the last ones left in the engineering wing, a whiteboard between them covered in a half-finished proof. Neither of them was ready to walk away from yet. "Most of us were trained to solve the problem in front of us. You solve the problem underneath the problem. Comes from a lot of nights with nothing else to do but think," Nathan said, and there was no bitterness in it anymore. Just plain fact, the old wound finally settling into something he could speak about without flinching. There were still hard moments. A handful of executives who'd signed on to Marcus Webb's complaint remained at the company, having survived the fallout by distancing themselves publicly and quickly enough to avoid Marcus's fate. And Nathan occasionally caught one of them watching him with an expression that hadn't quite softened into acceptance. He didn't let it consume him the way it might have a year earlier. He'd learned, slowly, that not every room needed to love him in order for him to belong in it. Emma adjusted to the change in her own way, proud in the unselfconscious manner of an 8-year-old whose father had suddenly become, in her telling, kind of a big deal, though she remained far more interested in whether he could pick her up from school on time than in any of the professional details. The new salary meant things that had once required careful calculation. New shoes when she outgrew the old ones without waiting for a sale, a proper bicycle without training wheels for her 9th birthday, the quiet, steady knowledge that if something went wrong, there was finally a cushion underneath them instead of empty air. Nathan never let himself take that for granted. He'd lived too long on the other side of it to ever stop noticing the difference. 3 months after that first all-hands meeting, Vivian found herself standing outside the same conference room on the 39th floor where everything had started, watching through the glass as Nathan led a training session for a room full of engineers, a whiteboard behind him covered in notation, his voice calm and patient as he walked them through a concept one of the junior staff was struggling to grasp. He paused, listened to a question, considered it seriously rather than brushing past it, and then reworked his explanation entirely to meet the engineer where she actually was, rather than where the textbook assumed she should be. It struck Vivian, watching him, that this was perhaps the truest measure of everything he'd survived. Not that he'd become brilliant again, because he'd never stopped being brilliant, not for a single day of those 12 hard years. It was that he'd come back into a room full of people and chosen, deliberately, to be generous with what he knew, instead of guarded. Somewhere underneath the worn work boots and the cracked leather and the years of quiet, anonymous endurance, he'd held on to something a lot of successful people lost along the way without ever noticing it was gone. The simple, stubborn belief that knowledge was worth more when it was shared than when it was hoarded as proof of your own importance. She thought about Marcus Webb sometimes, in the months that followed, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to pity. He'd built his entire sense of worth on being the smartest person in whatever room he occupied, and the moment that foundation cracked, he hadn't known how to stand on anything else. Nathan had lost everything Marcus had built his identity around: status, title, recognition, the comfortable architecture of being seen as exceptional. And somehow, impossibly, he'd come out the other side more solid than before, because what he'd held on to through all of it wasn't his reputation. It was simply who he was, stripped down to the truest version, tested by more loss than most people ever have to survive, and somehow still intact. That, Vivian had come to believe, was the actual lesson buried inside everything that had happened. Not the dramatic stuff, not the system failure or the boardroom confrontation or the dismissed executive, though all of that mattered too. The real lesson was quieter and harder to swallow if you let yourself sit with it, honestly. The world is full of brilliant, capable people quietly disappearing into jobs that don't deserve them. Not because they lack talent, but because life asked something enormous of them at exactly the wrong moment, and nobody bothered to ask what that cost. We walk past people every day and decide, without realizing we're deciding it, how much of them we're willing to see based on a uniform, a job title, the calluses on their hands, or the car they drive, or the neighborhood they go home to. And most of the time, we never find out how wrong we were, because most of the time, nobody happens to be standing outside the right conference room at the right moment with the right question. Vivian didn't think Nathan's story should be remarkable. That was the part that sat heaviest with her, the part she found herself returning to on quiet evenings long after the dust had settled. It shouldn't take a catastrophic system failure and $300 million on the line for a company to notice the person who'd been capable all along. It shouldn't take a CEO with a personal connection digging through old personnel files at 2 a.m. Somewhere in the world, she knew, there were other Nathans. Other people who'd given up something enormous to care for someone they loved, who'd quietly kept a piece of themselves alive in stolen hours after midnight, who were never going to get the lucky break of a glass wall and a whiteboard and someone willing to actually stop and ask what they saw. She couldn't fix that for everyone. But she could make sure, at least inside the walls of the company she'd built, that it never happened again on her watch. On a Friday evening in early autumn, nearly 6 months after Nathan had first walked into that break room in a uniform one size too big, Vivian found herself at his house again, this time not out of investigation or guilt, but simple, easy invitation. Emma's 9th birthday, a small backyard gathering with a handful of her school friends, a cake Nathan had clearly attempted to decorate himself with more enthusiasm than skill, and string lights he'd hung crookedly across the porch that somehow made the whole yard look warmer than anywhere Vivian had been in years. "You came," Nathan said, meeting her at the gate, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, dressed down in jeans and an old sweater, flowers still dusted faintly on one sleeve. "Emma invited me personally."
Vivian said. I wasn't going to say no to that. They stood together near the edge of the yard for a while, watching the children chase each other across the grass in the fading light, Emma's laughter rising clear and bright above the rest, and Nathan was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. I want to thank you, he said. Properly. Not for the job, for seeing me before any of this happened, for walking into that break room on my 5th day and not letting me disappear the way I'd gotten so good at disappearing. You did the hard part, Vivian said. I just refused to look away. That's not nothing, he said. You'd be surprised how rare that actually is. She looked out at the yard, at Emma blowing out candles a few minutes later, surrounded by friends, at the small, sturdy, hard-won life Nathan had built out of almost nothing, brick by brick, year after exhausting year, never once letting his daughter feel the weight of everything he'd been carrying. It wasn't a perfect life. It had cost him more than anyone should reasonably have to pay. And there were still scars in him that would never fully smooth over, places where bitterness could have taken root and chose, somehow, against every reasonable instinct, not to. Make a wish, baby, Nathan called out, and Emma squeezed her eyes shut tight, took a breath, and blew out all 9 candles in one determined try, her friends cheering around her. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the dishes were done, and Emma had finally fallen asleep clutching a new stuffed animal against her chest, Nathan walked Vivian out to her car under a sky finally clear of the gray that had hung over the city for so much of this story. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking, for the first time since she'd found him, like a man who had finally, fully arrived somewhere he intended to stay. What happens now? She asked, not entirely sure what she was asking. Now, he said, I think we just keep building. The work. Emma, whatever this is between us that I don't think either of us has quite figured out how to name yet. He smiled, a little uncertain, a little hopeful. 12 years of carefulness still visible underneath, but no longer running the whole show. I'm done disappearing, Vivian. I spent a long time thinking the safest thing I could do for the people I loved was to make myself small enough that nothing could touch me. I don't believe that anymore. I think the safest thing I can do for Emma, and for myself, is to actually take up the space I'm allowed to take up. I'd like to help you figure out the rest, Vivian said. If you'll let me. I think I'd like that, Nathan said. She drove home that night past the same gray buildings and tired traffic that had once felt like a leash around her own life. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, none of it felt heavy at all. Somewhere behind her, in a small house with crooked string lights and a half-decorated birthday cake still sitting on the counter, a man who'd spent 12 years convincing himself that surviving was the most he was allowed to ask of life had finally, fully, let himself want more. Not fame, not vindication, not even the prestigious career the world once promised him and then quietly took away. Just the simple, stubborn right to be seen for everything he actually was, in a world that had nearly let him disappear without anyone noticing at all. And maybe that was the real ending worth telling. Not that a billionaire rescued a janitor, and not that a genius finally got his due, but that somewhere out there, every single day, there are people carrying entire universes inside them that the world has simply stopped bothering to look for. And the only thing standing between who they are and who everyone assumes they are is somebody willing, just once, to stop walking past and actually ask the question. If this story moved you even a little, you already know the answer to who you want to be the next time you walk past someone the world has stopped looking at twice.